Charles Leclerc and Ferrari stunned Formula 1 by winning the Italian Grand Prix, denying McLaren what looked like a comfortable 1-2 finish and the chance to finally overtake Red Bull in the 2024 Constructors' Championship. For a long time, it looked as though Oscar Piastri would win easily, and Leclerc's best hope was maybe fending off Lando Norris to finish second, but that didn't account for a bold Ferrari strategy call and some incredible driving by Leclerc. Monza has so often been a one pit stop race, but this year's Grand Prix took place on a revised layout and a brand new track surface, which offered higher peak grip than before, but which also stressed the softest tyres in Pirelli's range quite hard, causing them to open up as the stints wore on, a phenomenon known in the F1 trade as graining. McLaren went into the race quite worried about this. Piastri said it had been basically game over for the tyres in practice once graining set in, and found it pretty difficult to keep the medium compound rubber alive during his first stint, which only lasted until the end of lap 16. At that point, getting through another 37 laps on one set of hard compound Pirellis seemed pretty unlikely, especially given both Red Bulls had started the race on that tyre and run into graining as early as lap 10. And the pace at the front was hot. Even in the first stint, with the cars fat with fuel, Piastri was running consistently in the low 1-minute 24s, about 1 second per lap quicker than had been consistently feasible in FP2. Leclerc was hanging with him too, having got past Norris on lap 1 when the McLarens tripped over each other at the second chicane. A comparison of Piastri and Leclerc during that crucial second stint on the hard tyre reveals Piastri was lapping just under a tenth and a half per lap quicker than Leclerc on average for the 20 laps between completing the out lap from his first stop and the in lap for his second. But by this stage, both McLarens were running into graining problems with their front left tyres. Norris had been complaining about excessive understeer hurting his outside front tyre even in the first stint, and McLaren added a couple of turns of front wing angle to try to counter this at his first pit stop. Norris was lapping almost 4 tenths per lap slower than his teammate during that middle phase of the race, and still couldn't keep his front left tyre from graining up, not helped by a lock-up of the brakes at one stage which damaged the tyre. McLaren team boss Andrea Stella says the problems Norris encountered were also present on Piastri's car, though probably not quite to the same degree, and because of these concerns, it pushed McLaren into making the second pit stop. There was a trend in the pace at the front where it dropped off anywhere between 3 tenths and half a second per lap from lap 34 to lap 37 when Piastri made his second pit stop. At this stage, McLaren figured Leclerc's Ferrari had also run into this tyre-destroying graining phase, and therefore he would also be forced to make a second stop. But that isn't what happened. Leclerc wasn't really able to improve his pace much, but he was able to stabilise it, completing the final 16 laps of his race at an average pace of 1 minute 23.602 seconds per lap, only 0.04 seconds per lap faster than he'd been running before Piastri made that extra stop. Once McLaren realised Leclerc's pace wasn't going to fall off a cliff, they encouraged Piastri to go flat out and chase Leclerc down for victory. Piastri had around 18 seconds to make up, and 2 Ferraris to overtake. He managed to overtake one, but fell 2.6 seconds short of catching Leclerc. In Piastri's words, he needed that final stint to be perfect. Getting delayed while lapping Lance Stroll's Aston Martin meant it wasn't, and so Piastri fell just short of winning what looked like a race for the taking at the end of lap 1. Monza was always likely to be a better story than Zandvoort for Ferrari. Maybe not this good, but certainly an improvement. Monza's track profile played much better to the Ferrari's inherent slow corner strengths than Zandvoort did. It has traditionally been one of F1's best cars at getting through slow chicanes, with a power unit configuration that also gives it excellent acceleration, and a suspension setup that is quite forgiving over the curbs. This circuit also lacks the sort of long-duration, high-speed corners that expose the Ferrari's bouncing limitation, that forces it into running at downforce sapping higher ride heights than is ideal. Ferrari also brought a potent Monza special low downforce rear wing to this race, which Leclerc credited with improving Ferrari's straight-line speed and aiding his path to victory. Alongside this was a floor upgrade designed to alleviate those bouncing problems that have been worsened since Ferrari's failed Spanish Grand Prix upgrade. Altogether, this meant Ferrari looked in much better shape from the off, in what was, from the get-go, an incredibly tight battle between F1's 4 best teams. But Leclerc only qualified 4th, behind the Mercedes of George Russell, so his chances of stealing a win heading into this race still looked incredibly slim. Even after Leclerc forced his way between the McLarens on the opening lap, Ferrari didn't really expect him to fight for victory. Ferrari had no particular tyre life advantage it could count on based on Friday practice, during which the Ferrari had actually looked marginally worst of the leading cars in terms of long-run pace, and ultimately only one of the Ferrari drivers made the one-stop strategy work, which means there's a certain element of Leclerc magic here that made the difference. If you want to understand how Leclerc managed to pull off the seemingly impossible, don't do what McLaren did and underestimate him. Yes, there's an element of patience and a bit of luck involved if you're waiting or even hoping that the graining will clear and the tyres will come back to you, but there's also a lot of skill. Leclerc actually rolls out this kind of performance more than he's given credit for. He's not just a one-lap specialist like some think, he's one of the very best on the grid for pulling off sneaky, tyre-whispering races like this one. Leclerc's got an excellent feel for the tyres. Usually it's where the limit is under traction, but he's also very skilled at protecting the front axle. That's a mix of judging how to bring the tyres in at the start of the stint and how hard to push at the right time, knowing where to lean on it around the lap, and even stressing the rear axle more in certain places to gain time there and then go easier on the front somewhere else. Flirting with the limit of the tyre has often given him a marginal but vital difference at the end of a qualifying lap as the rear dances around, but it's also a vital weapon in the races. The one stop was Leclerc's preferred strategy pre-race, but he seemed to have similar doubts to Piastri at one stage, especially as Ferrari had seen how much Red Bull was struggling with its front left early on when starting the race on hards. Leclerc was still optimistic it was possible though, and Ferrari gave him more time to judge it than Piastri had. Once Piastri pitted, Leclerc felt a small but significant difference driving in clear air without a car in front of him. Coincidentally or not, around the same time the graining cleared up. His experience and feeling behind the wheel helped convince him the one-stop was back on, but still, nobody imagined Leclerc would be so quick. He drove further and faster on the hards than anyone expected, and a comparison with teammate Carlos Sainz shows the difference Leclerc made. The gap from Piastri to Leclerc was 5.4 seconds when they stopped, and Sainz was 10.7 seconds behind Leclerc, but at the flag, Sainz was 15.6 seconds behind him. Both were eking their tyres to the end, but Leclerc was 0.2 a lap faster and more consistent, despite his tyres being 4 laps older. If Leclerc had run his extended final stint at Sainz's pace, then Piastri would have caught him at the end and probably passed him. The stars aligned well enough for it to be worth trying. The execution was all Leclerc. Just look at how the rest of the front runners all shuffled back into the right kind of positions and gaps as before everybody made their second stops, whereas Leclerc was the outlier. McLaren's cars started first and second on the grid, with its wounded championship rival Red Bull back on the fourth row, and while it has still slashed the gap to Red Bull in the constructors' standings to just 8 points, it was inevitably very disappointed to miss out on victory here. Really, this was a golden opportunity to take the lead, and for Norris to take a bigger chunk out of Verstappen's Drivers' Championship advantage. But there were no team orders at play once again, so beyond the role of the team's strategy choice in its defeat, were the actions of its drivers a pivotal piece of self-sabotage as well. Norris suggested to Sky Sports F1 after the race that the time Leclerc gained against the two McLarens when Piastri overtook Norris on lap 1 and Leclerc split the two cars as well, won him the race. That's an oversimplification and far too definitive given all that followed, but many are understandably asking if the way it was handled overall was not in McLaren's best interests, especially in the context of a distant Norris Drivers' Championship hope. And there were many claims that the wrong McLaren finished second because there was no order for Piastri to let Norris by when it became clear he was not going to pass Leclerc and win. Let's tackle the Piastri pass on lap 1 first. It was brilliant and perfectly judged. Norris claiming that if Piastri had braked 1 metre later and they'd have both been off is irrelevant because Piastri didn't. So that pass with no contact adheres perfectly to the ghastly papaya rules we heard get referenced in the Grand Prix. There's no point trying to choreograph the opening lap of a race, it's too chaotic. Getting through the first corner safely did potentially give McLaren the chance to hold position, but it's still far too early to try to shut things down. Piastri was entitled to fight. He did, he made his move cleanly, end of. But what about what followed? Should McLaren have moved Piastri aside? Norris said he had no interest in asking for that, because he's not here to just beg for someone to let me pass. He did, however, admit he would love it if McLaren and Piastri threw their weight behind him and his championship bid, although even then Norris conceded it's for the team to decide. Norris reckons the title is still on, but it's still a long shot even with Red Bull's problems, and Piastri was the stronger driver in the race at Monza, having also outraced Norris before the summer break at Spa and in Hungary before the team orders saga there. It's only one of the past 4 races where Norris has been conclusively better than Piastri and beaten him on merit. If Norris was at his Zandvoort level week in, week out, it's a different conversation. But this inconsistency shows why McLaren can't just prioritise Norris from the off.